It basically boiled down to small heads, was what they said. And McShane, who was the author of this, he'd gone back and looked at Shane Jones's work, and he excoriated it, describing Shane Jones as a socialist watermelon, and proving his point, at least in Owen McShane's own mind, about the head size of ministers of finance by a detailed taxonomic comparison with the elephant, the skull of a blue whale, and a dinosaur. And I think this is very typical of the Business Roundtable. And then they have selective use of data. While it's absolutely true that all the ministers of finance have had a head size smaller than that of a blue whale, it's also true that the entire human race has had their head size is smaller than that of a blue whale. You can actually see a guy standing next to that skull up there. And therefore I would say it's not much of a pattern. But nevertheless, small heads is an interesting conclusion to reach. So this leaves us with the question. We've got two wildly different results. They couldn't be more different. Who is correct? And I think there's an interesting answer to this. Neither. Now, I've been through and I've analysed the data. Of course, I've had the benefit of a good few more data points than these guys, and also the advantage of being mathematically numerate. And I've done a pretty detailed statistical analysis on cranial diameter. And what I discovered, I hope you can see that there, this d subscript e, that's the effective cranial diameter, is greater than the absolute value of pi times sigma. Now, I sense a certain underwhelmed response there in the audience. In layman's terms, what that means is that New Zealand ministers of finance since 1975 have had very big heads or very small heads, but nothing in between. They've been at the extrema of head size. In fact, they've been in either the top 0.1% or the bottom 0.1% of the distribution of human head size. It's quite extraordinary. I'm just going to take a drink. So I'll take you through this on a sort of step-by-step basis. Rob Muldoon, 1975. Cranial diameter of 28 centimetres. I'll put that into perspective for you. The average cranial diameter of an adult male is 18 centimetres, so he's 10 centimetres better. It's a fantastic achievement. Roger Douglas. Smaller than Muldoon, but I'd just like you to all just sit there for a moment and just appreciate what a great big head he has. It's like the world's biggest turnip. And another, well done. Well done, Sir Roger. David Cagle. Now, David Cagle's a very interesting point. And maybe I'll turn this over to the audience. Can I have a show of hands? Who think David Cagle may have an average or small head? Right. Well, you're all wrong, you people. And I wouldn't give you a job as a qualitative assessor of cranial diameter. But you could be forgiven for your mistake. David Cagle, the thing about David Cagle is a very large moustache. And so it creates this optical illusion. And so your brain sees the moustache and it says this moustache can't be as big as it is. And so your brain downgrades it, and at the same time it downgrades Cagle's head. And so his head looks normal or small. But don't be mistaken, it's a whopper. It's actually bigger than Roger Douglas. Ruth Richardson, she's at the other end of the extrema. And whenever I see Ruth Richardson's head, I always think of the poor old headhunters. And what a disappointment it would be for them. And, if you were a headhunter, you were walking through the jungle, and towards you down the jungle path comes Ruth Richardson. And you get all excited, somebody else's head which I can chop off and shrink. And then as her head came into focus, the disappointment. And you'd think, I just won't even bother with this one. Some other headhunters clearly got here ahead of me and shrunk it. Bill Birch, very similar to Ruth Richardson, and notice that he gives his cranial diameter as 11.09 centimetres. And that's very typical of people with an abnormal head size. They always try and quote it to 2 decimal places to try and claim that either the most or the least that they possibly can. And one of the great things about the 1990s used to be seeing Bill Birch and Ruth Richardson standing together. And I just used to look at it and think, my God, where do they get people with such small heads? It's fantastic. Oh, hang on, we've got a bit of delay here, I think. Oh, maybe not. Oh, yes, a delay. Oh, yes. Now, he's back again now, so I'll come to him later. Next was Michael Cullen, probably the most interesting cranial diameter of any Minister of Finance. I turn this over to the audience again. I'll go for the show of hands again. Who thinks he's got a big head? Okay, yeah. Small head? How about an average-sized head? Just a few of those. Well, you're all wrong. And this is to do with quantum mechanics, or more particularly Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. This is Heisenberg's famous thought experiment, the gamma-ray microscope. That blue dot is an electron, of course, and the thought experiment postulates taking a measurement of the electron with the gamma ray. The gamma ray is the squiggly green line. And what Heisenberg was able to show was that you couldn't accurately measure the position of the electron at the same time as measuring the momentum of the electron. If you accurately measure the position, then you could only make an inaccurate measurement of the momentum, and vice versa. Now, if you take away that blue dot and you put Michael Cullen's head there instead, then exactly the same principle applies, except it's not momentum as the other parameter, it's cranial diameter. And so we can measure either the position or the cranial diameter of Michael Cullen's head, but not both at the same time, which is very difficult when we're interested in the cranial diameter, because the only way we can measure it is if we don't know his position. So we have to wait for him to leave the room. But then once he's left the room, the paradox is we can't measure his head. But luckily, even if he's not in the room, we know that his general position, which is on or near the surface of the Earth. So if you do the calculations, you can set an upper bound to his cranial diameter, which is the distance between the Earth and the Sun. So his cranial diameter is less than 150 million kilometres. Now, just looking at eyeballing his head there, and thinking about it logically, I would say it was significantly less than 150 million kilometres, but we can't prove that scientifically. Bill English. I had the privilege to be at a sort of a meeting thing with Bill English a couple of years ago, and I was just hypnotised by the size of his head. And I went straight away on my phone to the parliamentary website to look up his cranial diameter. 49 centimetres, nearly half a metre. And it was tremendously reassuring to me, because I thought his brain must be gigantic inside that skull. And what better, how reassuring that is in these terrible economic times that we live in. And I think I was telling my brother about it that night, and my brother's done papers in anthropology and human biology, and he said, I don't agree with your analysis there at all, I'm afraid. What he pointed out was that the surface area of the head increases with the square of diameter. So with a head that big, you've got a surface area which is an order of magnitude, or several orders of magnitude, larger than a normal head, and therefore that many more nerve endings. And so the brain power required to take in the information from those nerve endings is gigantic. And in fact, according to my brother, a very large proportion of his brain would have to be devoted to taking in the information from those nerve endings. And I can only quote my brother on this. He said, in fact, Bill English may be no more intelligent than the average Cocker Spaniel. And depending on your view of Cocker Spaniels, that is quite a lot less reassuring. I don't know if I would vote for a Cocker Spaniel if I knew they were going to be made a cabinet minister. And this well may be the thought, if I've just indulged in a bit of telepathy here, this may be the thought that's going through your minds now. And as a scientist, I don't have to defend this. Scientific curiosity is all that's needed for me to spend my time looking into such a pattern. But my original training was as an engineer, so I do like to see practical applications. And I can reassure you by saying that there is a practical application to the discovery of this pattern, or the discovery and analysis of this pattern. I should have actually told you, but to remember Bill English's cranial diameter. That's actually graphed here. The vertical axis is cranial diameter. And after I'd been at this meeting, it was a couple of months later, I thought, I'll just go back to the parliamentary website and just double-check that 49 centimetres, because was it 49, was it 49.04? There was some, it was important to have the decimal places, perhaps. And the horizontal axis here is calendar date. And to my astonishment, his cranial diameter had been reduced on the parliamentary website. And this piqued my interest, and I thought, I'll just keep an eye on that. A couple of months later, it goes down again. Now, as a scientist, it's very clear to me what's happening here. Bill English's head is collapsing under its own gravitational field. And you can use exactly the same equations that you use for the collapse of a neutron star to figure out when his head will get so small that it goes out of that magic 0.1% of extreme cranial diameter. And so it's about mid-December. I think it was 19th of December, plus or minus 3 days. And what that means, it won't be any conscious decision on his fellow cabinet ministers. They won't say, oh, his head's shrinking, we don't want him anymore. But it'll be at some subconscious level, and they'll just say, English just isn't the same as he used to be. You know, he's lacking that X factor that he used to have, and we should roll him and get someone else. And the useful thing about this pattern I've developed is that we can now use that pattern to identify who his successor might be. And now, don't get alarmed by the next slide. This isn't the successor. But who we can rule out is Roger Douglas. He has a very big head. Of course, he's perfectly qualified in that department to be Minister of Finance, but he's been ruled out by John Key, and therefore we can rule him out too. What about the spokesman for Finance, David Cunliffe? Well, he's qualified, but let's measure his head. 18 centimetres, that's exactly average. Clearly, he is not Minister of Finance material. And then... So I go through, I look at the whole of the current MPs, and the interesting thing is, apart from one man, Rodney Hyde, who's leaving, everyone else has a head size that they share in common within the distribution of 99.8% of the population. There's no one else at that extreme. And so then you have to look out of Parliament and say, who are the candidates coming in? Are any of them potential contenders? And it is at that point that you strike gold. This man, the cranial diameter of only 7 centimetres, the most extreme head size that has yet been in Parliament. And perhaps this is the time for me to mention the paradox, I think, of Don Brash, and that with a head this small. His political career has been based on railing against political correctness, and yet he has been a tremendous beneficiary of political correctness. If he had been born 50 years earlier, the only possible career he could have had was as the pin-headed man in a circus. And he couldn't have gone into university because they had a minimum cranial diameter requirement in those days. And so his whole career has been based on, I think, positive discrimination. And if you imagine a job interview, if you were on a job interview panel and Don Brash came into the room, you couldn't not give him the job, could you? Because you couldn't possibly countenance the look of disappointment on that tiny little face. And of course, the governor of the Reserve Bank, particularly with Richardson and Birch in there, they not only had the positive discrimination, but they had an incentive to hire him because when the two of them stood beside Brash, their heads looked quite large in comparison. But look, let's just step back a bit and look at what I started off talking about, which was the maverick science. And it's just kind of a life lesson, I like to think of it, in that it was an approach born out of desperation in the miserable circumstances that I endured in my daily, my weekly encounters with Catherine Ryan, and yet some useful science has come out of this, and the science says take a look at your next Minister of Finance. So that even in difficult analytical situations, science properly applied can win through. So yes. Thank you, and the end.